Welcome to the Honest Money Show. A big thanks to our sponsor, Shop Bitcoin Australia, for making today's episode possible. Joining me today is Robert P. Murphy. Robert is a renowned economist. He is the chief economist at Infinio Group, a senior fellow at Mises Institute, and he's authored a number of books, probably the most famous of them being Choice, which I'm still reading. Robert, welcome to Honest Money.
Thanks so much for having me, Anja.
Yeah, you're very welcome. So I'm so happy to have you here today. Obviously, as a Bitcoiner, I'm quite new to Austrian economics and feel very lucky to have you as a guest on the show today to talk about this, because my journey into this has been sometimes backwards or even scattered. And I would love to have sort of the experience of a first-year grad student, just to get to understand this wonderful topic from scratch and in a more linear way. So how would you describe Austrian economics? What is it?
Sure thing. And I should probably make the obligatory joke at the front end that what happens occasionally, and happened like my friend Tom Woods, he was I think he was debating somebody on Austrian economics at one point in the United States, and he went and gave his thing, and the other guy got up, and it was clear the other guy thought it was Australian economics. And so anyway, that was kind of funny. So the name obviously comes because the original founders were from Austria. So Karl Menger in 1871 wrote what's translated as Principles of Economics. And that ushered in, it was called the marginal revolution, if some of your viewers are familiar with that turn of phrase. It having to do with like the old classical school. They thought of things like as aggregate classes, like, you know, diamonds and water and things like that. And it was hard to explain market prices with that old paradigm. And so it was the so-called marginal revolution that had people thinking on the margin. That's where that term comes from. So when you go into the store, it's, you know, when you're trying to decide, oh, should I buy this many bottles of milk or not? It's not, do you like milk more than you like bread or something? You know what I mean? It's no, one more bottle of milk or one fewer. So it's thinking on the margin. So that's where the name comes from, that Menger and Böhm-Bawerk were from Austria. And so that's where the title comes from. But nowadays, when we talk about the Austrian school, obviously, as you can tell from my accent, I'm not from Austria. You know, a lot of them are from the United States. So it does tend to be very free market oriented, like it's opposed to government intervention. But that's not its essence, right? It really is an objective school of thought. And you said you're working through my book Choice, for example, and you can see it really is a scientific enterprise where it just talks about, this is the way that we approach the study of market prices. This is what we think causes the business cycle. This is how banking works, and so on. I guess I'll just give a few of its characteristics, and you can take the questions however you want to go to elaborate. Some of the defining features of the Austrian school is it's what's called methodological individualism, right? So they don't try to explain the economy in terms of aggregate statistics, like, you know, aggregate demand or the price level and things like that. Instead, they really try to start from individuals and what motivates them and how do they make their decisions, and then you can build that up. And the Austrians do have a theory of the business cycle, for example, but it really is grounded in, with individual underpinnings, as opposed to some of the other schools of thought where just from the get-go, when they try to explain what's going on in the economy, it's like using aggregate statistics or variables. I guess the other defining feature, let me just mention this, of the Austrian school that even distinguishes it from like the Chicago school is the Austrians tend to be very big on like applying the standard principles of the benefits of market pricing to money and banking. And so most economists, if you said, hey, should the government be picking the price of oil? Should there be a group of experts who every month come out with their meeting and they announce, going forward, the price of crude oil, we're going to target between this many, per barrel. Most economists would say, no, that's socialism. You can't do that. But yet, even in the so-called capitalist countries, they have central banks where they have a group of experts who come out and periodically give announcements about what the interest rate target is going to be. Right. And so that seems kind of weird. And so the Austrians, I think, are the most consistent on that to say, no, just for all the same reasons you would want to have freely floating market determined prices for oil, likewise with interest rates. It doesn't help the economy to have a group of experts in charge of the money stock or, the safe interest rate, things like that. So again, I'll let you take the conversation, but that's, I guess I'll stop there. But that's part of the defining characteristic of the Austrian school. And again, they tend to be very hard money and in favor of laissez-faire in banking, and that distinguishes them even from a lot of the Chicago school economists who also typically are free market compared to Keynesians.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would love to know, like, what is the scope of economics? And is this also where the different schools of thought diverge in terms of what that scope is? Like, what should an economist deal with and not deal with?
Okay, yeah, that's a great question. So I did spend some time in the beginning of that book choice, like just defining that, like we're here. This is a book about economics, but what are the boundaries of this science or this discipline? So I can tell it exactly the way that like Mises. So Ludwig von Mises was one of the giants in the Austrian school. He had many accomplishments. He sort of unified what you could call micro and macro. Put it this way. So Karl Menger and the other pioneers in the marginal revolution, they came up with a way to use subjective preferences to explain the price of apples versus oranges, things like that. And they said, oh no, it's not about the labor theory of value. It's not about the cost of production. It starts with subjective valuation, and you can build up, pricing from that bedrock. But once that, started to take over the profession, still there was a logjam with explaining money prices, because it seemed like to say, oh, the reason, how do we explain the purchasing power of money is just by its subjective valuation. It looked like you were arguing in a circle, right? Because why do you value money? Oh, because you can buy things with it. As opposed to why do you value apples? Well, because they satisfy your hunger. You like the way they taste. You can make pies with them. But with money, it seemed like, no, the whole function of money, the utility it gives you, is from its purchasing power. And so to try to explain that by subjective valuation seemed like it was arguing in a big circle. So Mises solved that problem. I kind of went on a detour there, just explained like Mises had a bunch of theoretical accomplishments. So anyway, in his work, when he's explaining the history of the science of economics and its boundaries, he said historically, social science, people who wrote on lots of things, like back in the day, the medieval scholastics and things, they wrote on all sorts of things. Even going back to Aristotle, wrote all sorts of stuff, including what we now would think of as the scope of economics. And he said, so humans noticed there was this regularity in market phenomena. Like it seemed like there were some patterns there, and they were trying to figure out, what are the rules governing how prices behave. So that was clearly always part of the subject matter. But then Mises said, with this new marginal revolution, that it wasn't just, we came up with a better theory to explain market pricing. He said once they made that switch and they went from looking at like how many labor hours went into something, or what were the costs of production, right? Because those were the two like sort of classical modes of trying to explain, like, why does a stagecoach trade for 10 times as much as this cow? And and the classical school would try to look at like, well, what are the things that went into them, and like do it that way. And the subjective marginal approach did it the other way around. It said like, no, the services of a stagecoach are more valuable than what the cow can give you, and that's why so that's kind of the thing. And so Mises said, once that innovation occurred, which at the time was just sort of like just coming with a better way of explaining market prices, that kind of revolutionized the subject matter of the field, because now you were talking about, the human mind psychically or, subjectively evaluating things. And that was the bedrock starting thing to explain market prices. And so he said, once they made that shift, now the paradigm was like rational action. Okay. So, and that's why the title of Mises' magnum opus, it's not, economics, or it's not, how does the economy work? It's human action. And so that's, and so he called that praxeology. So he called that the science of human action. And so the idea was anything where it involves a human who has goals and tries to rationally, choose means to achieve them, that's what praxeology studies. And then economics proper is part of that, where, you have private property and money prices, right? So that's kind of the way Mises thought about it, like the tools we use to analyze that stuff. Really, it's, the whole field is purposive action or purposeful behavior. And then if you have certain institutional prerequisites like private property and money, then, there's like a subset of that. That's what we now call economics. So that was kind of the way he did it. You're asking about, like, do other schools of thought do that? If you read, and in that, that first chapter of Choice, I give quotes from other schools of, like, Chicago school people, and they'll say things like, trying to maximize your well-being under conditions of scarcity or something. They'll or using limited means and unlimited desires, and that's what economics studies. So they say things like that, or choice under constraint. So they're all kind of groping around that same idea where people have a bunch of goals that they subjectively pick, but there's limitations imposed by nature on them, and then that's kind of the subject matter of economics.
Yeah. So, not assuming, we know the dominant school of thought today in economics is Keynesian school. And I'm very keen to understand, like you've already touched on a number of things, how the Austrian school differs from other schools of thought. But what are the main kind of like the top three things where the Keynesian school and the Austrian school differ?
Okay, so the big one is like what causes recessions, right? And so for the Keynesians, it's a shortfall of what they would call aggregate demand. And so the idea is that if the economy can be in a situation such that the revenue that the employers, that the firms are getting from selling their product is not enough to justify or support full employment. And so the economy can just be stuck in this odd position where there's it's equilibrium, meaning like the economy is not going to quickly move out of this. It can be kind of stuck in this rut, and yet there's large scale unemployment, even though those workers are eager to work and they're just as skilled as the people who have jobs. So it's not like a matter of that they don't have good skills or something, and the economy's just stuck like that, right? And so in the Austrian and in the old classical view, that shouldn't be possible, right? That it should be, wages should fall until the point at which, so as wages come down, employers want to hire more workers, and the lower the wage gets, workers are less eager to get a job. And so at some point, the wage should fall such that now anybody who's still not working, it's because they say, yeah, that's not a big enough pay for me. I'd rather not work. And so, so that's like the old classical story, and the Austrians largely agree with that too. And the Keynesians say that no, that the economy won't fix itself like that. And they have and Keynes in his book, The General Theory, goes through the argument as to why that might not happen. All right. Part of like intuitively, the story is like, well, because as the wages are falling, well, now like the business, like the people have less money to spend. And so like now the revenues might fall from the employer's point of view. You know what I mean? So it's not like you can just hold everything constant and just have the employer cut the wages, which is kind of like the way the old classical people were thinking. So that's kind of the argument Keynes gives as to why you can get stuck. So related to that, then, if they're diagnosing the problem differently, it's not surprising that their solution is different also, right? So for the Keynesians, they'll say the first thing that should happen is the central bank should cut interest rates, right? Because that will stimulate spending, right? Because the whole point is, in the Keynesian view, the private sector is not spending enough if we're in a recession, either on consumption or investment. And so the first thing to do is, have the central bank cut interest rates, because other things equal, that will stimulate spending. People will borrow more if interest rates are lower, and households will save less, right? And so they'll spend more. But it could be that even that's not enough. And even if the central bank cuts interest rates to zero, still, what if you have this shortfall in demand? And then they say that's now the time where it's auspicious for the central government to run a budget deficit, to just add aggregate demand that way to jumpstart the economy and get it out of the rut. So the Austrians disagree with all that. And so on the deficit spending stuff, they would say, look, the government, when it spends money, it's just diverting resources from the private sector into political outlets. In general, why would you expect that to be an improvement? So that's one avenue of just saying that's not fixing it. But then more generally, they're going to say the reason the economy finds itself in a recession in the first place is not just an act of God or a natural disaster. It's because of prior episodes of government artificially pushing down interest rates and causing this, false, unsustainable boom that then leads to a crash. So in the Austrian view, it's the Keynesian, medicine that's actually keeping the patient sick. And so like these recurrent boom bust cycles, the Austrians say that's not just a natural feature of capitalism. That's because you have this government banking, money system laid on top of, the underlying market economy, where they keep artificially pushing down interest rates that fuels this unstable boom that then busts. So that, that's obviously two big things. But then more generally, in terms of the differences of the school, like I said, it's not merely, policy prescriptions on which they differ, but even just their whole approach. The Keynesian school, fancies themselves to be very empirical and scientific. They think they're like chemists or physicists. It's just they study the economy, and we come up with hypotheses, and we have testable predictions, and we go get the data. And so they think they're being real scientific and modern. Whereas, so here, not all Austrians embrace this, but the ones who follow in the Misesian tradition do, where they think economic law is a priori, like it's almost like Euclidean geometry in that sense. And so they say that, you start with basic axioms, and then you logically deduce things. Now, to apply it in a given situation, you have to use your judgment and rely on empirical measurements and things. But in terms of like just basic underlying economic law, they say that that's actually, you largely get that through introspection. So that's just another, that's a methodological difference between the two camps too.
Yeah, it's interesting. I know this isn't quite the same, but like my background is in marketing, and recently I find in the last 10, 20 years, there's just been this really push towards, data-driven marketing, and you need to have results for everything. But marketing has always been like a science of human psychology in a sense. And sometimes, even if something performs really well, you still need to understand what aspects of human psychology made that certain thing perform well. Yeah.
Just to give so right, and I hesitate to say that because for some of your listeners who aren't familiar with this, I know if I say that it's going to sound like, oh, this is like medieval scholasticism or something, and for example, for people to learn how to build bridges and things, you have to study geometry, right? And to learn Pythagoras and the Pythagorean theorem or whatever, it's not that people go measure 1,000 triangle or 1,000 right triangles and see, and it's like you're missing that's not how you do proofs in geometry. Like, it's a logical deductive thing, and then you go apply it and quote the real world and everything, but you're armed with these basic things. And I would just say, like, when people are arguing about tariffs, free trade versus tariffs or other things, usually they resort to pretty simple fables to try to get the intuition across. And it's like once you see the principle, then it's like, oh, okay, and that kind of helps you sort through, because the real world is really messy and complicated. And then the last example I'll give is with in the United States, President Obama was elected in the fall of 2008, right when the global financial crisis hit. And then there was this thing called the Obama stimulus package, that they passed in early 2009. And they predicted, when they were trying to sell it, they were warning that unemployment at the time was like 7.5% or something like that. And they were saying, hey, if we don't pass this thing, unemployment might get up to like 9%. But if we do pass it, we'll contain it, and unemployment, we'll get to 8% and change, but it won't break into 9. So they went ahead and passed it. They got the stimulus package, and then actual unemployment went above 10%. Right, so unemployment was worse with the stimulus package than what they were warning might happen if we don't do anything. So in terms of an empirical refutation, you would say what more could have happened? And yet the way the Keynesians handled that episode was they said, woof, it's a good thing we passed that stimulus package because the economy was in worse shape than we realized. Right. So from their point of view, they're being consistent. But so again, and they even had, ex post studies showing this is how many jobs were saved or created by the stimulus spending. And when you went and looked at the way those models, or those measurements worked, there was no empirical outcome that would have made them say this was a failure. Like the very assumptions they built into their analysis, made it have to be the case that government deficit spending created jobs, right? So I'm saying they're being just as dogmatic or ideological as Mises is, but they're fooling themselves. They're pretending they're being real empirical when it's like, no, their whole framework assumes the outcome, and then they just calibrate it to come up with specific numbers, but it builds in the way they think the world works. So
Yeah, interesting. I'm curious to know, Bob, what is your opinion on like why Keynesian school is the dominant school today? What is it about it that appeals to the masses?
So the most Austrians would tell this story, and it is a bit, I guess, self-serving, but I think it's true. Is that there was a healthy debate. So the economics profession used to be more free market oriented. They weren't all completely dogmatic, but they were generally very free market oriented. And then in the early 30s, the Great Depression happens, right? And it looks like something's seriously wrong with the capitalist economies. And so then John Maynard Keynes comes out with the general theory. And in that book, and he's a very smart guy. And the book was kind of a mixture of like really detailed arguments and like some, math in there that made it look real sophisticated, but also he had a lot of observations on things. He just seemed like he knew a lot. And so it was an impressive work. And it was very well done rhetorically. The reason he called it the general theory is he was sort of making like an analogy to what was going on in physics, right? So in physics, Einstein comes along, in his relativity, he didn't say that the whole Newtonian framework was wrong, right? He didn't say, oh yeah, Newton's an idiot and all the physicists that came before. What he said was, oh, the more, and by the way, I'm not talking about general versus special relativity. I'm just saying in general relativity, like the equations about things like mass and whatever. When you use Einstein's equations, those are like more general, but then for for velocities that aren't high relative to the speed of light, it reduces to the old Newtonian laws. So the idea was, what Newton described was just a special case where things aren't moving very fast and and their masses aren't very big, right? So that was kind of the way he handled it. It's like, I'm giving you a more general framework that's can cover more scenarios, whereas Newtonian mechanics only covered so that's what Keynes was saying. He's saying, oh yeah, those classical economists, they're right that if the government spends more, then that means the private sector spends less, and if the government's going to build a bridge, those resources had to come from somewhere, so that means there's fewer, resources for radios or whatever elsewhere. He said, but only in the special case when we're at full employment. He said, if we're stuck with, high unemployment and like spare capacity, then the old classical wisdom is wrong. And in that world, if the government runs a deficit and spends $100 billion, GDP goes up by $100 billion. Because you're just putting your workers who are sitting at home doing nothing now go to the factories. So that was the way he rhetorically handled that. So it was very clever that, in other words, he wasn't just saying everyone else was wrong before me. He was saying, they were studying this special case. And here's like where the cynicism comes in. It's very popular or, very palatable to say, we can fix this tomorrow. Just the government needs to start spending money like a drunken sailor. Whereas in the old view, that would have been very irresponsible. And like, it might be politically popular to just start handing money out, but no, don't be naughty boys. Whereas Keynes is giving them permission and saying, no, the wise thing to do is to just start handing out money and just buy stuff. And so who doesn't want to hear that? If you're a politician and the economy's bad, that's music to your ears, right? So that's the the cynical story. And again, it's Keynes did have a bunch of intellectual firepower behind what he did. So I'm not saying Keynes and his disciples were all consciously lying, but in terms of explaining institutionally why, all the big universities now that get tons of funding from the government, their economics departments, are they filled with Austrians or are they filled with Keynesians? And no, they're filled with Keynesians. I think that's not shocking or the central bank employs, the Federal Reserve employs hundreds of economists. Most of those economists don't think the Fed should be abolished, right? Isn't that shocking? So I'm just saying that, there is that element to it. And again, but prima facie, I think people thought capitalism failed in the 30s and Keynes was giving them an alternative. So I don't know if you want to go down that path. I've written a whole book on the Depression, and I think that ironically, it was the exact opposite. Like, what was different in the 30s was, for the first time, the various governments were doing a lot of helping in peacetime that they previously hadn't. So it's put it to you this way, in the U.S. at least, the way the history is taught is that Herbert Hoover, who was the guy who was in office from 28 to 32, he's the guy that sort of gets blamed for the Depression in the United States. And the complaint against him is that he didn't do anything. He just sat back and was like, okay, but the standard story isn't that before Hoover, all the other presidents in the United States had been big interventionists, right? They were, what I mean? So it's kind of weird that all the presidents up to Hoover did nothing, but on his watch, we had the worst depression in history. And then thank goodness FDR came in, right? So that's kind of, it's like the joke I say, it's if a plane crashes and someone says why, and you say because gravity, right? Like, so, well yeah, but gravity applies to the other ones. Like, there must have been something more specific. So the same thing with Hoover. Whereas what is different is Hoover was the most interventionist when the stock market first crashed, and he told all the labor unions and big businesses don't cut wage rates. And so that, I argue in my book, that's why unemployment went up so much, is because prices were falling because they were still on the gold standard, but wage rates were not allowed to fall. And so labor got artificially more expensive in 31, 32, and that's when unemployment went up. Anyway, so I'm just saying that there were lots of things that changed, and it looked like the old policies were failing. And so it looked like, oh yes, our old faith in capitalism is wrong. And then Keynes comes along and says, here's a technocratic fix that happens to give a lot more power to, central banks and politicians. And so, to me, it's not shocking that, that swept the day.
Yeah, I didn't read the book, Robert, but I watched a talk that you did at the Mises Institute on this subject matter, I think back in 2011 or 2014, somewhere around there. It's really good. So I'll link it to the podcast notes as well for those who want to learn more about the causes of the Great Depression or the alternative view. But I'm very curious to know, do you see in this century a world where the Keynesian school loses popularity?
Sure. So I should perhaps, give a little bit more of some more of the history of economic thought. So what I'm going to say is definitely what happened in the United States, but I think it also happened, in Europe for sure, and then, elsewhere too, is in terms of, the profession. So it's true that standard people, there was like a debate, like in the 30s, Lionel Robbins, who was at the London School of Economics, invited Friedrich Hayek to come give a series of lectures there I think it was in 31. And so Friedrich Hayek is a member of the Austrian school, a disciple of Mises. And so Hayek was one of the pioneers in the Austrian theory of what happens in the business cycle. And so I'm saying there was a lively debate in the early 30s, and Hayek came and gave, his lecture. And unfortunately, Hayek is difficult to understand. Like he's very smart, but he's not a very clear presenter. If you can get lost in what he's trying to say. And so, Piero Sraffa reviewed Hayek's book called Prices and Production, which was like adapted from those lectures he gave to try to, to give the Austrian view of like, what the heck just happened, right? The world is mired in this terrible depression, and here comes the Austrians and telling what they think happened. And Sraffa reviewed, and Keynes was the editor of the journal where this review, and it was just a scathing review. And so um, I can understand why mainstream economists now who like go back and read that stuff would say, "Oh yeah, these Austrians, what the heck are they even like?" It was complicated. What are they talking about? Um, and so, so yes, the Keynesians kind of won that battle, at least on paper, for a while. But then there was the Keynesians were discredited, right? So here I'm answering your question, like could the Keynesians go? That I'm saying intellectually in among economists, Keynes or the Keynesians suffered a pretty big defeat in the 1970s, right? So there had been like theoretical objections to their position, their modeling and whatever that had been coming, people like Robert Lucas and Milton Friedman, people like that. But where like things really got bad for them was in the 70s because there was what's called stagflation, where there was high price inflation and high unemployment at the same time. And in the sort of crude Keynesian paradigm that kind of, ran the world in the 1950s and 60s, that should have been impossible, right?
Yeah.
In that kind of crude Keynesian framework, the idea was, oh, if you have high unemployment, that's because there's not enough demand. So just go ahead and, lower interest rates and stimulate spending that way. And if that doesn't work, the government can run a big budget deficit. So we'll just throw enough spending at the wall and that'll fix things. And then the idea was, oh, if you overdo it, if you're spending too much money such that, unemployment falls and now everybody's at the factories and the factories are humming. And now if you just keep printing too much money and having, too much deficit spending, what will happen is there's too much aggregate demand and then prices will start rising rapidly. And so then in that case, then you pump the brakes. You don't spend it, you raise taxes, you cut spending. But the idea was you were supposed to get one or the other. You either have an economy with high unemployment but low inflation, or you could overheat and you'd have full employment. Everyone's got a job, but geez, eggs and gasoline keep getting really expensive. But in the 1970s, you had both at the same time. You had high unemployment and prices at the grocery store were rising really rapidly. And so, like, what was the central bank supposed to do? It seemed like whichever way they moved, they were going to make one of those worse. And that wasn't supposed to be possible. Whereas the, like, Chicago school kind of people had been giving an answer all along to that, to say, well, this can happen. You guys are thinking about it. So they built in what's called expectations, right? And the idea was, just real quickly, if people don't expect inflation, you can kind of fool them. And if the central bank prints a bunch of money and goes and spends it, then, you can get by and you can reduce unemployment. Everyone can go back to work. But once labor unions start realizing this pattern, then they're going to say, oh yeah, we wanted $15 an hour for our workers, but now that we know the central bank's printing a bunch of money, we want $20. And so the fact that the central bank inflates isn't going to all of a sudden get everyone to go back to work, because they're just going to raise their wage demands knowing that, we got to keep up with inflation. And so then you get into this vicious spiral. So that's kind of what happened. And so then, there was a revolution in economic modeling. It kind of goes back to what I said at the beginning about how the Keynesian models can be really simplistic, whereas the Austrians have like individual moorings and, so in the old school models, there was no one in there to guess what inflation was going to be. Like, people weren't even in the model. And so then that was part of the revolution, like in the late 70s going into the early 80s, that now to get your paper published in an economics journal, you had to have agents in the model that understood how the world worked. And they made rational forecasts about inflation and things, whereas before that wasn't even in the model. I'm saying that there already is a sense in which the old school, like sort of crude Keynesianism of the 50s and 60s is dead. And now there's more, but still, you're right that the people now, they're called new Keynesians. Like, you just slap a new in front of it and now that fixes it. So in terms of, that stuff, I'm not merely saying this because of the podcast venue here, but I really do think Bitcoin changed a lot, because it showed, for one thing, you can have a private sector money. Whereas that, like, for some people, that was just kind of, they just assumed that, oh yeah, money is what central banks are in charge of. And so just to have Bitcoin is this possibility out there, I think challenges that paradigm. And then, things like, oh, and its max units is 21 million. And so that forces people to have the conversation of, well, can you have a monetary system where prices kind of fall every year? And yeah, why not? And so I'm just saying it kind of shatters those old views because in like standard Keynesian framework, they want prices to rise every year because they need to have room to cut interest rates in case the economy gets into a rough patch. Because if you had 0% inflation, then we can't cut interest rates too much because we'll hit what they call the zero lower bound. So that's why they like prices to go up and up every year at the grocery store to give them room to cut if there's a bit. So I'm just saying everything about Bitcoin and the kind of world that would produce if people use that as the money is very anti-Keynesian. And so, I think that, both the theoretical problems for people who are like, in economics proper, but just in terms of the financial sector and the people who are out there doing stuff, I think, blockchain-based finance in general is kind of showing that, yeah, these Keynesians don't really have a good model that can explain everything.
Yeah. And one thing I've observed, and I'm curious to know if this has some merit, but like if I look at the Keynesian economists versus the Austrian economists, even though there is some disagreement within each school amongst, Austrians don't always agree with other Austrians on everything, but it just seems to me that there's a lot more disagreement between Keynesians internally as to why certain things happen. It's almost like their explanations of things are so elastic.
Yes. So I agree with your observation. I endorse that too. You're right. I think that's a true statement. And then I can think of at least two reasons why that would be. So one is benign and one is like malignant. So the one that is more is not like a knock on the cane. It's just because they are the dominant, the sort of default.
Yeah.
It makes, in other words, I think probably a lot of mainstream economists today, if you and I tried to classify them, we'd say, oh, they're, new Keynesian or whatever. They might not be walking around thinking, I'm a new Keynesian. Like to them, that might just be like, I believe in supply and demand. Yeah, I'm an economist. You know what I mean? They might just think, no, that's just economics. What are you talking about? Right. So in other words, it's so mainstream and such the default position, they might not even think that that's anything special. And so in their mind, when they're like, when you and I would say, oh, look at the Keynesians are all arguing with each other, I think they would just think, yeah, we're economists and we have different opinions on things. What are you talking? You know what I mean? Whereas if you are in one of these more niche subgroups like the Austrians or there's things like the post-Keynesians or maybe for modern monetary theory or, Marxists are still around. They're like the reason you're leaving the mainstream and joining one of these subgroups is because they appeal to you. And so there almost is this more inbuilt homogeneity in your views. You know what I mean? Like with religion, you could do a similar thing, right? That you could have Roman Catholics could be arguing about, but if someone goes and joins some very particular religious sect, they're going to be very much in agreement because that's the whole reason they joined that thing. You know what I mean? They have a bunch of print doctrines that separated them from everybody else. So there is that element, but I do think there's more to it than just that, like to, explain the phenomenon that you observed. And I think it is, I'm an Austrian, so I must have picked them for a reason. I think they're just more rigorous, right? Like a lot of the stuff that Mises does in his work, I've heard other economists try to read it and they say, this is philosophy. What the heck is this? Like he spends a few chapters explaining what's the scope of our field of study and what are the logical foundations of economics and what assumptions are we making and stuff. Whereas other economy, book 1, chapter 1 starts measuring GDP or something, or, here's the production function. You know what I mean? So I'm just saying it's like Mises takes some time to really think about like, what is it that we're doing here, guys? And other economists think that that's, like I said, philosophy or a waste of time or whatever. So it's not surprising to me that like you're viewing and seeing the Keynesians seeming more open-ended and just, hey, anything goes. Whereas the Austrians have some more inbuilt discipline, I guess I would say, that kind of, anything that's published in an Austrian journal is going to adhere to a certain set of principles more so than in, a standard economics journal. I guess except for like the math stuff, right? Like the more mainstream economics journals would say, oh, you got to have a model and it's got to, you got to have proofs and things. There's got to be some mathematical rigor to it. Whereas the Austrians, it's more verbal. So I guess that's the distinction. But the Austrians say, right, ours is more logically internally consistent, whereas you guys, like, yeah, you make a math model and we just think the model isn't really capturing what the economy does.
Yeah, one day I will read Human Action. I'm going to work my way up there because I know it's like 900 and something pages and it's very like difficult read. I'm reading your book very slowly because each time I read over something I'm like, what did he mean by that? And then I'll go read over it
Mhm.
again to try absorb it better.
Well,
But
you might you maybe you caught this, but like the point of that book choice, the way it was commissioned was somebody said, the guy commissioning it, David Thoreau, said undergrads can't read Human Action. We need something that's like 300-ish pages that covers all the material Human Action does, but it's one book and it's accessible to an undergrad. So yes, the choice was explicitly. I went through, section by section in Human Action and then distilled it down into choice. So that's what choice is doing.
need a way to sign, verify, and secure your Bitcoin? Australia's one-stop shop for Bitcoiners has you covered. From signing devices, nodes, and backup solutions to BitAxes, Daycor, and apparel. Visit shopbitcoin.com.au. Yeah. So yeah, step one, it's read choice. Step two, read Human Action. But I want to know your like the Austrian perspective on common resource problems. This is something that's always discussed in Australia. Another thing as well that I never knew until getting into Bitcoin, and it just feels so silly to say now in hindsight, but I didn't realize how closely economics is linked to politics, and you can almost guess someone's political views based on what their economic beliefs are. So yeah, let's talk about common resource problems and what the Austrian view is on that.
Sure thing. So I'll give some like standard results, and then if there's particular things that people in Australia are worried about, obviously let me know. So this might surprise some of your listeners to hear, because they hear, oh yeah, this group, these people, they're very free market, they don't like the government, they're pro business, they probably are fine if businesses dumping chemical, and no, that actually isn't it, right? So here I want to be clear. This is sort of merging into what's called libertarianism. So Austrian economics is a science. It's not a political ideology, but in practice, certainly in the United States, most people who are fans of Austrian economics are also political libertarians, right? So again, it's not like a logical connection, but in practice, that tends to be what happened. And partly for what you just said, Anja, that if your economic analysis says, oh, what causes the business cycle, it's government intervention in money and banking. And so most people would say, if that's how I think the world works, my political views are I don't want the government doing that because I don't want recessions. You know what I mean? So it's kind of like that it's not shocking that those two things tend to go together. So anyway, Murray Rothbard was one of the giants in the Austrian school. And he also wrote a lot on, he's like one of the founding fathers of the American libertarian movement. And so his take on, things like pollution and stuff like that, where most mainstream economists say, oh, this is an area where the free market fails and you need government intervention. And Rothbard takes that standard narrative and kind of flips it on its head. And he said, no, the old, common law property rights tradition from Great Britain that, that the American colonists brought over, that's what all you need for a lot of this stuff. And so, yes, if there's some factory and they're dumping chemicals in the river and then people downstream, are getting sick, under the old, common law tradition, they could go ahead and get an injunction against this. Hey, you're violating our property rights. And he said it was what happened in, during the Industrial Revolution was that a lot of the big businesses, they had a lot of political power and they were wealthy, and they would influence the judges to not enforce those, those complaints. Right. So in other words, or if there's some factory that's putting smoke in the air, and then like, the people who have their laundry out, to dry, they're getting sooty, just because of stuff. And then those people, they should be able to use the courts to stop the factory because they're, they're damaging their property. But the courts wouldn't enforce that because they didn't want to impede the Industrial Revolution. Right. But, I'm talking like in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And so Rothbard was arguing, saying, so far from this being, the free market problem, it's showing that it was actually, the government run judicial system that they just made the calculation that we're going to favor, the big business owners versus these, dinky little homeowners who are complaining about their water or their air quality. And so that's, the way Rothbard said, that's actually like, strict adherence to property rights would solve a lot of these problems. And it was only the government ignoring property rights from, small property owners that led to, these environmental problems. And then another like standard kind of thing would be, I'm sure you've heard of this, like what's called the tragedy of the commons. And so, yeah, it's a well-known problem that if you have a common resource that, like you got a lake and there's a bunch of fish there, if anyone can just show up and just fish as much as they want, that's probably going to be too much. It'll deplete, the resources. And so that's why people say, oh, you need the government to have like, I don't know if you have it in Australia, but here we have like fishing seasons. Like you can only fish between this time. And they even have kind of crazy rules like you can't use engines on the boat. It's got to be just a boat where you have paddles or something, or you can't have nets that are bigger than such and such, right? So like they're artificially hindering the productivity of the fishing operations, but that's only because they still have this weird system where it's like nobody owns it. And so if you had just a privately owned fishery, which, those do exist, they could set whatever rules they want. They could just say, oh, if you catch this many fish, we charge you such and such, right? So, and that solves all the problems. Or, back in the day in England, they had the enclosure movement. And so, when they had grazing, if anybody could just take their cattle and graze, then there would be too much grazing, right? And the land wouldn't be able to replenish itself. But once they invented barbed wire and, and said, no, here's property rights and you own this land, and then people knew, so if I don't have my cattle graze on this plot of land, and then other people can't just come in and take it and then let the grass replenish, well, then that solves the problem. So with all these things, economists in the Austrian school would tend to say the problem is ill-defined or ill-enforced property rights, and once you just specify who owns what, then if there's some kind of weird outcome happening, people have the ability to just make contractual arrangements and rearrange things and to avoid that outcome, because it's if there's some resource being depleted, that's not good for anybody. So if you could just get somebody to be the owner of that, they can take steps to protect it.
Yeah, and this touches a little bit on the direction I want to go into next, and that is like central planning / central banking.
Sure.
Even when I asked ChatGPT is quite direct and brutal. If you just put in a very simple prompt like, what's the problem with central banking? I was quite surprised just how direct the response was. Sometimes it does tend to have a bit of a bias where it's trying to protect institutions or established norms. It wasn't on this occasion. But yeah, let's talk about the problem with central planning and central banking. They're kind of one in the same.
You just want me to go?
Yeah, go.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't know if you want to get more context to it. Yeah, sure. So, and here again, the Austrian school they have a special place in history when it comes to, well, on both topics actually, but in terms of central planning, meaning like outright socialism in the old school tradition. And I should be clear, nowadays, people use the word socialist like just somebody who wants a big welfare state. And they'll say, oh, that's socialism. And I understand, why someone could say that. But, historically, socialism had a very particular meaning, as in the government owns the means of production, or at least the large scale, And so Ludwig von Mises, people, the Marxists as well as, the fans of the free market, agree that Ludwig von Mises advanced one of the most powerful critiques of central planning. Obviously, the Marxists think he was wrong, but they acknowledge that, yes, this guy's attack was, one we had to grapple with. Where Mises argued that, yeah, up till now, so he wrote this, I guess this would have been, 1912? Is that when he first came? Yeah. I'm thinking of the Theory of Money and Credit. 1920, I think, is when, he had this first broadside come out. And he argued that up till then, yes, like the conservative critics of socialism or communism, everything they wrote was fine insofar as it went. Like they would say, hey, there's an incentive problem, right? That if you're paying people according to their needs and taking from their according to their abilities, the high productivity people aren't going to work as hard, and the other people aren't going to work as hard too that are getting paid based on how many kids they have or whatever, not in terms of how much time you put in the factory. And so there's that issue, and then there's also like the power corrupts, right? That people recognized having a group of experts in charge of where everyone goes to work. You're probably not going to be in a position to criticize the government if they can just send you to Siberia, right? Say, oh, that's where your labor hours are needed, comrade, right? So people, or if the government owns all the newspapers, do you think they're going to publish a bunch of criticism of the ruling elite? Probably not, right? So there was, and Mises, said, yeah, these are all valid criticisms, but he said that it's overlooking the fundamental economic problem with central planning as such is that it lacks market prices. And he said, the central planner, like if you really had full-blown socialism, then you're not going to have market prices, for the farmland or for the factories or for tractors and things like that, because they're all owned by the state. And he said the problem with that is there's a million different ways you could produce things, in terms of technological recipes and ways to use more land or less labor and so forth. And so how would the central planners know what to make? He's saying, because they could go ahead and do it. They could come with a 5-year plan and everyone can go out and do it. And Mises said, even if we just stipulate that, suppose all the comrades are enthusiastic and they work, there's not a shirking problem, there's not an incentive problem, they just do what they're told. And, assume that we're not worried about corruption. Imagine the central planners really are angels and they just want to do what's in the best interest of their people. His point was they wouldn't know what to do. They could go ahead and do something. They produce a bunch of cars and a bunch of houses and diapers and, ships and so on. But then how would they know ex post, should we do that again next cycle or should we tweak what we did? And he's saying there's really, it's a difficult problem because the issue is you don't know what the cost is, right? Like the economic cost, because there's so many thousands of different interrelationships to say, should we use this ton of iron ore in this project or in this one? And it's really difficult to, pin down the implications of using it in one line versus another. And he said the way this is solved in a market economy is through the profit and loss mechanism. Like once you have genuine ownership and all those things, you have market prices, and then you can look at an enterprise and say, did it make good use of society's resources this last cycle? You just say, did it turn a profit? And so what does that mean if they turned a profit? It's that their customers paid them more money than the money they had to spend getting the inputs from other people. And that's the sense in which they added value to those resources, right? And so if something's profitable, you want it to continue. And if it suffered a loss, that's like society's way of saying, society has a higher use for those resources than what you're doing with them. You're squandering them. And so businesses that keep suffering losses eventually go under, right? So that was Mises' explanation of, the problem with central planning is that they lack what he called economic calculation. All right, so that's kind of just a full-blown critique of outright socialism. So then, central banking is like one element of that. And there, I'll just be real quick here. The specific problem with central banking is that it fuels the business cycle. And so in Mises' framework, prices serve a function. They help communicate information, just like I just said with the profit and loss and guiding entrepreneurs to be good stewards of society's resources. And the interest rate in that framework, what function does it serve? It helps coordinate stuff over time. And so, real intuitively, if the households become very future oriented and they want to, not consume as much today to be able to consume more down the road, they save more. That pushes down interest rates. That gives entrepreneurs the green light to invest in longer projects, right? Because there's more savings available and the lower interest rates, lower costs of borrowing and so forth. But what if the reason the interest rate fell isn't because households saved more, but because the central bank just printed more money? So now you're like giving the green light to the entrepreneurs to have longer term projects, more grandiose projects. They're bidding away workers from other lines, so wages are rising. Everybody feels rich. It's a boom, but it's based on quicksand, right? Because it's just the central bank printed up money. There actually wasn't more saving. And so that's the problem with central banking, that it fuels these boom bust cycles.
Yeah, and you've mentioned the business cycle a number of times. I'm very keen to know, like, what's the definition of that theory?
Well, sure. So by business cycle, I just mean the seemingly natural ups and downs in the market economy. That seems like there's periods. So over long stretches of time, standards of living go up, right? Like real GDP per capita, if you want to use that metric, tends to be higher than it was, 10 years ago for just about every place you can look on Earth. But it's not just a smooth, constant rate of increase. There's wild upswings and then crashes. And so, so that's what people mean by the business cycle. And then they have different theories as to what causes it. And I'm saying in the Misesian view, meaning Ludwig von Mises, what his explanation was, he thought it was actually banking per se, what you may have heard is called as fractional reserve banking. So the idea of banks, in a sense, lending out more than their customers have put in on deposit. And so that makes interest rates artificially low and gives this, false stimulus. And then the problem with the central bank is it comes in and just exacerbates that. So in Mises' view, if banking were limited to lending that was close to 100% reserves, you wouldn't have these boom bust cycles. And so that's that's kind of his vision.
Yeah, and one thing I'm very curious to know is, recently I think a lot of people have obviously been very burnt by what happened during the pandemic. Governments worldwide printed a lot of money to respond to the crisis, and I'm very curious to know how the Austrians would have handled that situation. We have a black swan event, something unforeseen. How do you solve that responsibly?
Right. Okay, so here it's tricky because, I know a lot of Austrians in practice would say, oh, the governments of the world really fed into the hysteria and they exaggerated the problems and, it may either out of ignorance or malice, like they had other reasons for wanting to exert their control and so forth. And plus, the more we learned about this was a government funded project that, whatever. So a lot of that you could just see, hey, if we just had smaller, limited government, this wouldn't have happened. And I think that's true. But I think the more interesting question is, okay, yeah, sure. This particular case, you could say that, government kind of created the problem and the lockdown certainly exacerbated everything. But like what would happen, what if there really were a genuine crisis of, some virus that breaks out that really, is extremely contagious and very fatal, right? Mm-hmm. Like, something from a Stephen King novel or something. And so there, again, with all this stuff, it's, I think just allowing for the more concrete definition and enforcement of property rights is the way to solve this stuff. That's strictly speaking. So you wouldn't need government to enforce things is what I'm saying. That I think that the correct policy regime just says, businesses can set whatever policies they want. Right. And so in practice, yes, I think people took things way too far with this, with COVID in practice. And there have been lots of studies to try to show, those areas or those countries that were very aggressive didn't have better outcomes than the ones that were very lax and so on, to say things like that. But again, in principle, what if there was some, really serious virus that came out? Even in a situation like that, I would not favor giving the government the power to determine, hey, are you allowed to leave your house or not? But the flip side is, I think you do need to give businesses that flexibility, right? That a business, I think, should have the right to say, if you want to come into this store, you got to have a mask on, or you got to show proof of vaccination, or an employer could have the right to say, if you want to work here, you need to do whatever, things that the employer wants. Because I think you got to be consistent with it, is what I'm saying. Because if you're not, if you're just, because the reason I'm saying this is I know a lot of libertarians in the United States were so vehemently opposed to even businesses voluntarily insisting on masks or whatever, that they applauded when the Florida governor and I think the Texas one as well, they said it's illegal. They were saying, in other words, if you're a business in our state, you can't insist that people have masks on, or you can't, insist that people show vaccination status. And I thought that was the pendulum swung too far the other way right there. So that's what I'm saying. I think the consistent libertarian position is, private property rights, let people do. And then in terms of like, well, how does that relate to the Austrian school? Again, I think just like central planning doesn't work, and you sort of, leave decentralized decision making up to the people who are in the best position to have all the relevant information and who have skin in the game. Likewise, I would say, who cares the most about whether the workers of this particular factory all get sick? The owner of that factory, or even the workers themselves, but also the owner of that factory is the one who is really in a position to, assess the trade-offs of, well, geez, if we just close down, we're not making any product. But on the other hand, if there's a serious virus going around, everyone comes in, they all get sick, and half of them die, we're not making any product either, right? So, as opposed to the governor just deciding, you know what I mean, where if they just, shut down, then they get applauded for doing the smart, healthy thing, but they're not suffering the losses from all that lost output as much as, So anyway, that's kind of my view, that again, with all this stuff, just like with the environmental issues, if there is some weird problem, I think ultimately giving people property rights and giving them the decision-making ability, that's the best thing in practice, because the politicians aren't going to have the right information, and they don't have the right incentives.
Yeah. It's interesting because like Australia's got a very different culture to the US. And I think a lot of that comes from our history. Like the US was born out of a revolution. It was built on libertarian principles. Whereas Australia's got a very like egalitarian societal values, and definitely during COVID that came out even more, that we are somewhat a collectivist society more than most people would have thought prior to COVID.
Can I stop you
Um,
real fast, though? What's
yeah,
funny is, and this is partly just because Americans are so ignorant, but the stereotype, at least that I have here of you, is that you guys are real rugged individualists. You're just tough guys, and you go out and you fight crocodiles and stuff. So
that's one or two characters, just one,
right, right.
like, but no, that's not the case. Because even as you're speaking, I'm listening, and I'm like, I'm a curious person. I love learning, but I can just totally sense that there will be listeners from Australia who think that the government is the trustworthy party and the private sector is bad. And to me, like, it doesn't really necessarily make sense, because why would you trust one group of people over another group of people? They're all just people. But it's very interesting because, yeah, they definitely would trust something like that to be outsourced to a government rather than the private sector. I cannot see a reality in Australia where people feel comfortable saying, let the corporations decide. I just can't see
Well,
it.
yeah, and I appreciate that, and I like the way you phrase it too, because there is a stereotype that like libertarian ties, especially like out of the United States, I'm sure have this, this stereotype of we think that businesses are good, and that, oh yeah, entrepreneurs are good, are heroes, and it's those dastardly politicians. And some people do talk like that, but I think like you just kind of hit the nail on the head. The more correct thing is that people in general are fallible, and you got to be careful with them. And so it's not so much that, the businesses are better than the politicians, but rather you're just limiting the scope of how much damage they can do, right? And so just like with a government, like in the United States, we have the phrase checks and balances, where the idea is, you don't want the president to just be able to do whatever he wants. He's not a king. Like in theory, at least the Congress is supposed to raise taxes. In theory, at least Congress is supposed to declare wars. Again, the executive has really usurped those privileges over the years, but that's kind of the idea. And so I'm saying, by the same token, it's just a matter of like power sharing and checks and balances to say who should be in charge of, for this factory. If there is a virus going around, who should make the decision? Should the people come into work, or should they just shut down? And I'm saying it seems pretty reasonable to say the owner of the factory is the person to vest with that authority. Again, he can't compel if somebody's at home and says, no, I'm doing my research, or maybe I have a lung condition, I'm not going into work today. And if you want to fire me, go ahead. But no, so the employer can't enslave that person and say, no, you're coming to work or we're going to shoot you. The worst the employer can do is say, well, I'm going to stop paying you, right? Which, again, that is perfectly reasonable to say, the employee can't say, no, you got to keep paying me and I'm not going to work. So I'm just saying it isn't that this sort of naive view that people in the private sector are angels. It's just rather everybody is potentially a devil. And so therefore you got to limit everybody's power. And that, yes, if you're afraid of profit-seeking business and the bad things they'll do, okay, but the government has printing presses and they start wars. So it's not like government has clean hands either.
Yeah, absolutely. And, in hindsight now, thinking about how it would have panned out the whole thing had it been given to the private sector, I imagine you would have had some corporations that had somewhat balanced rules. Some would have been more strict and others would have been more loose. But I think, in that you would have had some sort of competition almost between the private sector where, you kind of naturally optimize based on what other
Exactly.
people are doing and how they're responding. And if you have one central entity where you have no competition and no point of reference, we did with other countries, I guess, but Australia is so isolated and we
Mm-hmm.
were possibly seen as one of the strictest countries when it came to lockdowns and things.
Right. Yeah. I'm glad you said that because, again, that's another huge virtue of decentralization and not, having the government monopolize those decisions is that, yeah, different companies would have tried different things and they all would have been watching each other and there would have been studies over time as to which things were more effective and so on. And that I think would have been better than what happened in practice because I think any honest person would have to say a lot of this stuff was just crazy. Like in other words, it didn't even follow from the science. It was clearly just, to make the public feel like something was happening. Like, I don't know what they did in Australia, but like United States, there were, in all the public areas, like all the water fountains had like tape put in front of them so you couldn't, and they were turned off, which you don't get COVID from, you know what I mean? Like you could go lick. If someone who had COVID licked the thing and then you went and licked it, you probably wouldn't get it, right? It was from breathing the air for a long time. Like that was the issue. And so I'm just saying, or people who were out jogging on the beach were arrested. And so like, that's just crazy. You're not giving COVID to someone, you're out jogging on the beach. That's just not how it's transmitted. So whereas staying in shape and getting out in the sun or whatever and keeping your immune system robust, that would be, a good thing to do. So I'm just saying it wasn't as if, oh, yes, there were a bunch of things that a draconian enforcement could have done, but we have people's civil liberties or whatever. That what I'm saying, it's not like with seat belts. Like that's a good example where, in general, yes, a large, normal sized adult driving the car should have a seatbelt on. That's going to, in the overwhelming majority of cases, be a good idea. And then you could have a question: should the government force you to do that? Or, leave it up to you. Okay. But I'm saying the stuff that the governments around the world did during COVID, it wasn't like that. They were enforcing things that made no sense, even on their own terms. And it was just clearly people, just going overloading with it or just getting drunk with power. And just, they liked this, or, like in the United States, again, I can't speak to what happened there. It was things like they kept liquor stores open because they were essential services, but you couldn't go to church. Right. And so it's just things like that, that seem kind of, anyway.
Yeah, the funniest example for me is on airplanes when everyone used to have to wear a mask throughout the whole flight, but when the food came out, you take it off and you eat your
Right,
meal.
right.
And it's like, well, everyone's got masks off. That's like just made no sense whatsoever. But that was a heavy discussion, and I want to pivot to something a bit more fun. Do you think Mises would be a Bitcoiner if he was alive today?
Oh, that's a great question. Um, I think for sure he would not want the government to interfere with people's ability to use Bitcoin in whatever capacity they wanted, and also to not have punitive taxation, that made it impractical to try to switch to a Bitcoin standard. I'm not sure, as you may know, early on especially, there were a lot of people who were fans of Mises who were skeptical of Bitcoin because of what's called the regression theorem. So I'll be real fast with this, but when Mises was explaining the purchasing power of money, one of the moves that he made, actually it goes back to something I said earlier in this conversation, if you remember, that there was this difficulty in taking the subjective marginal utility explanation of market value and applying it to money, because look, you're just going in a circle. It's like, oh, why do you value money? Because it can buy things. Well, how come money can buy things? Oh, because we value it. And this look, he went in a big. And so Mises broke that up with the time element. He said, no. It has purchasing power right now because you expect it to have it in the future. And why? Oh, because it had it in the past, right? So he kind of broke the time element, but then that like invited an infinite regress, because it was kind of like he's explaining gold's purchasing power today, partly by reference to our knowledge or our memory of it. Oh, it had purchasing power yesterday. Well, but why did it have it yesterday? Oh, because the day before, right? So it seems like you go back forever. But he said, no, you don't go back forever, because there was a point, we don't have records of it, but it must have existed logically when there was barter, no money existed, but people still would have used gold, for ornamental reasons or whatever, right? Like people must have liked gold even before it was money, right? And so that's kind of just like logically how Mises, made his explanation. And so a necessary part of that story was that the thing that right now is the money must have served in a past life as just a mere commodity. So when Bitcoin first came on the scene, a lot of fans of Mises said, this can't ever be money because, you can't eat Bitcoins. You can't use them to build a car. Bitcoin doesn't do anything except it could be a money. And so how can that be? And so they thought, it violated Mises' theories. So at this point, most Austrians have gotten over that, right? Because in other words, Bitcoin's clearly been adopted. People don't have a problem, pricing it right now. Like we can remember what Bitcoin's price was yesterday, right? So in other words, if you thought that story I just went through was going to pose a difficulty for Bitcoin, it should have never gotten off the ground. But now that it is where it is, that hurdle's been passed, whether it really was a hurdle or just a misunderstanding of Mises, right? So having said all that, though, like there are plenty of people who are fans of like Peter Schiff as being the most notable example, who still say, yep, Bitcoin's intrinsic fundamental value is zero. It's a bubble. I can't understand why it's lasted this long, but it's going to zero. If it goes to zero next Tuesday, don't say I didn't warn you, right? So Mises, was an old school guy, very conservative. It wouldn't shock me. I mean, for one thing, he would be astounded by color television, where, so I don't know. Well, I guess he lived longer. He saw color television, but I think it's possible he might have just thought this seems too weird. This is too intangible. No, a gold coin, like a bar of gold, that's money. That's hard. The government can't print more of those. So anyway, those are the two things for sure. He would be all for the freedom and go ahead and let people use it if they want. But whether he personally would be a hodler, I don't know.
Maybe he would get over it like all other Miseans have.
Maybe.
First they resist and they're like, oh, actually, but I'm curious to know, like, what actually made the Mises fan get over it, like, and become Bitcoiners? Like, how did they get past it?
I mean, so I pointed out early on, the thing I just said to you that, hey guys, you're right. There is this prima facie tension, but notice, and I was quoting from Mises to say, to show like very specifically what he was saying is, for something to become a medium of exchange, it must have first had some other use. Because his argument was, like, how would you know at day one what its exchange ratio was with all the other commodities, right? Unless it had previously just been a mere commodity that was in barter. And so I'm saying, Bitcoin, those 10,000 Bitcoins for the 2 pizzas, like, which is like the first documented transaction, they happened. And so, if Mises' story is right, the way you guys want to use it for Bitcoin, that first transaction, the guy with the Bitcoins and the guy with the 2 pizzas, they should have said, how can we come up with a trade? Because I don't know how many Bitcoins trade for a pizza. We have no record. We have no prior sales of Bitcoins for pizza, so I guess we can't do it. Well, they did do it. You know what I mean? So my point was that's where it would have stopped it. Once that happened, Mises' argument, if you're trying to use it to stop Bitcoin from doing anything, is already rendered impotent. So I think, I'm not saying I personally did, but other people could make similar. So I'm saying intellectually, once Bitcoin got off the ground, it really was the case that if you were an Austrian who understood what Mises was saying, you'd have to realize that this no longer applies. And then also other points I was making, like both Mises and Rothbard said in their writings that if in the future, for some reason, gold should lose all of its non-monetary value, right? Like if nobody liked gold jewelry anymore and nobody used it for filling their teeth and whatever, they said it could still continue to serve as the money. And their argument was because people still would have had the memory of the gold price the day before, right? So it's not like they all of a sudden wouldn't know how to value gold. And so, I use that argument. I think others could see that too, that once Bitcoin got off the ground and you had a market price as like an anchor to guide you as to, well, how much do I think it's going to be worth tomorrow, then, the fact that it didn't historically serve as, some mere commodity and barter, so what? You don't need it to. So I think there was that. And also, too, just, the passage of time, and it keeps hitting all-time highs and whatever. Like, after a while, like, well, how many times is Bitcoin going to die before we stop saying that? So
the frequency of that is dropping. So few more years, few more cycles at least. Now, final question I wanted to ask you was, obviously the Austrians love the concept of hard money, and it's been said that the hardest money always wins, or has won out of most cases in history, but maybe one. Where a softer form of money has won because the government stepped in and made fiat like legal tender and forced everyone to essentially use it because they prefer it for whatever reason.
mm-hmm.
I'm very curious to know, do you think or do you believe that the concept of the hardest money winning again can overcome all the institutionalized resistance there is against it?
Okay, so great question. Yeah, and let me make one point that I've stressed a lot is that there's once you understand the virtues of hard money, I said that what's cool about Bitcoin is there's a sense in which it's even harder than gold, right? Because of the $21 million cap. That with gold, in principle, they could go and mine asteroids. There's asteroids out there in the solar system. Lots of gold, and right now it wouldn't be economical to go get them, but down the road it could be. And so the idea is at some point, or when our technology progresses to the point at which we can just rearrange quarks or something and create new gold atoms out of other atoms, like at that point gold isn't going to be physically scarce anymore. And so the idea is it would be good if we had the ability to have a money that was mathematically constrained, not just physically, because those physical constraints again might not be binding. So that's a good thing to have in our back pocket, that we've got this, in principle, this money that can't be inflated, namely Bitcoin, or other cryptocurrencies that are like it. I would caution people though that even when we were on the classical gold standard, there still was the problem of booms and busts, and it had to do with, like, when Mises developed his theory of the business cycle, that was during the classical gold standard era. He came out in 1912 with his first, it was like his doctoral dissertation that made that case. And so what was happening were the banks were issuing paper notes that were claims on the gold coins, right? And if they issued more paper notes than there were coins in the vault, then you could get these boom bust cycles because interest rates would get pushed artificially low. So I'm saying even if the whole world adopted Bitcoin, and even if when you went into the store, everything was quoted in Satoshis and you just held up your phone and you had the private keys and you were doing, I'm saying that even if that were the case, if there were still third-party institutions that issued claims on Bitcoin, and that those things, after a while, like imagine like a stable coin that was tied to Bitcoins, right? So the stable coin itself was not Bitcoin, but it just, promised, we will maintain parity with it. And then so after a while, if the community started to trust those because they had a good track record, then that would in a sense be like inflating the supply of Bitcoins. Just in the way right now, your checking deposit with your bank is not, there aren't pieces of government currency in the vault backing that up. And so even though, your government just says what the currency is, the private banks can kind of inflate on top of that. So I'm saying that is still possible, that could happen, in which case, you'd still have these boom bust cycles. But, and here's the final point I'll make, though, is it's the reason Bitcoin has an advantage and there's more of a promise, or if it's not Bitcoin, something like it, because I know there's, with the block size and things, people are saying it would be tough right now. Bitcoin can't just replace all the money in terms of buying a cup of coffee. There had to be something, lightning or whatever. But the point is, the part of the reason people put their gold coins or their gold bars in the bank to get the notes was that it was just so much more convenient to walk around town spending the notes or writing a paper check rather than carrying around a bag of coins. But with cryptocurrency, there isn't that issue, right? Like, in other words, your online banking is just as convenient as holding your private wallet and keeping the private keys. You get what I'm saying? So there is a reason that you could expect more people to just hold the digital currencies themselves rather than giving them to another third party who then, could have the temptation to inflate. So that was my kind of long way of giving the context to say there still is danger even if everyone switched to Bitcoin, but there also, the very nature of Bitcoin does give it an inbuilt advantage such that it's possible enough people could be doing, quote, the right thing, that, the business cycle would largely be contained, or be kind of thing where people could largely opt out of it if they wanted to. And so, given the commerce that I engage in and the people I found around planet Earth who want to deal with me in the way that we think is appropriate, we're kind of like separate from these other people who are, wildcat speculators.
Yeah, interesting. And thank you so much for that answer. I'm a bit sad I won't be around to see it unfold for I will for the remainder of my life, but probably not for the remainder of Bitcoin's life. Do you have any final thoughts that you want to leave with the audience?
I would just encourage people that, I know the way economics is taught in school sometimes is very dry, but I would encourage you to read up in the Austrian school. There's a reason I was attracted to them. I think they're very intuitive, but just in general, these arguments over money and banking, I think this is like with, cryptocurrencies and stable coins, like this is all money and banking theory in action. And this is a very exciting time. And so I just let people know that you're living through something that's pretty special and try to appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for your time, Robert.
Thanks for having me, Anja.
That's it for this week on The Honest Money Show. A big shout out again to shopbitcoin.com.au for making this episode possible. Until next week, stay smart with your money and stay decentralized.